In this video, we're going to talk about bluff catching with hero calls. So what is bluff catching? Well, bluff catching is when we call a river bet with a hand that only beats a bluff, and that's typically going to be our medium strength value hands. Versus a tighter opponent, we'd fold them, but versus somebody that we think might have some bluffs within their range, typically our aggressive opponents, we can consider calling the river bets as a bluff catch. And it's called a hero call because when we call and we're correct, we're considered a hero. Now, here's the thing. It doesn't have to work that often. And we're going to talk about the math behind it. So if we take a look down here at bet sizing, I go from a quarter pot size bet all the way up to 1.5x pot size bets. And what I've done is I put together the pot odds and ratios, and I've also put them together in percentages, but I'm calling them our break-even percentage because when we look at this, if we win this amount of the time, that's going to be a zero EV play. So if we look at this, and let me get rid of all the highlighting, what you're going to notice is that when we go from a quarter pot size bet all the way up to a 1.5x pot size bet, it has to work less than 50% of the time. Even versus a 1.5x pot size bet, it only needs to work 37% of the time. And what I've been noticing for the last year and a half is that overbetting the river is becoming a more common occurrence because what it does is that it makes the person polarize where they either are bluffing or they have a very strong hand. And the other thing too is that it makes it psychologically very hard for the person to call because they know it's a lot of money. But what you need to understand from a break-even perspective is that when you call, you only need to be right more than 37% of the time for it to be profitable. Anything less than that, it's going to be unprofitable. But anything more than that, it's going to be profitable. And if we look at some of the standard sizing, if we look at anywhere from a half pot size bet up to a 3/4 pot size bet, it only needs to work anywhere from 25 up to 30% of the time. So I want you to understand this because whether we can call on the river or not, it's going to be based upon the pot odds price that we're given. And more often than not, it's going to be correct to call if we're facing an aggressive opponent. And if we think on average, we're going to win around 1/3 of the time or more. So let's go ahead and let's take a look at some example hands. So for our first hand, we have King 10 suited and we're in middle position. We open raise and we face a very small and odd sized 3-bet from an aggressive opponent who is 3-betting 22% of the time. And so this opponent has 3-bet 5 out of 23 times where they had the opportunity. So obviously they are 3-betting a really wide range. And then we get a fold from the big blind. And versus this sizing, we're never folding, so we make the call. And we have to consider what is this person 3-betting with. Well, with this odd sizing, it really could be anything. I'm not going to rule out any hand within their range. Because if somebody was playing a 3-bet or fold strategy out of the small blind, I'd expect them to bet our larger sizing. This just looks really fishy. And it looks like this opponent just wants to bump up the pot for some reason. So I would include any sort of pocket pair, suited connectors, suited one-gappers, weaker Broadway combos, weaker aces. I'm not going to remove anything. So with that said, let's check out the flop. And the flop is ace high, and we do get a check from this opponent, which tells me, well, they probably don't have that strong of a hand. Ace X combos isn't going to be a huge portion of their range, and I would expect this opponent to bet the flop if they did have an ace, so I'm going to assume they don't have an ace. I really don't have anything here, so I'm going to go ahead and check back as well. And we go to the turn and we hit a pair of 10s, and then we face a delayed c-bet. Well, when we face a delayed c-bet, we're obviously not going to be folding in this situation. And versus somebody that's aggressive, I'm not going to give them too much credit. They could have a pair of 10s just like us, but we have the second best kicker, and we know they don't have ace 10, so this is going to be an obvious call if they do have a 10. They could have a pair of 9s, they could have a pair of 7s, a pair of 6s, they could have a pair of 8s, a pair of 5s. They could have a lot of weaker hands. They could also have picked up a backdoor flush draw as well as a straight draw with a hand like 9-Jack or 9-7. So we make the call and we go to the river, and the river does bring in the backdoor flush and it does connect some of the straights, and we face another bet. And it is around a half pot size bet. So our pot odds is 25%, which we see up here. And versus this aggressive opponent with second best pair and not facing a bet on the flop, this is going to be a very easy bluff catch because we do have a medium strength value hand looking at the board. But against this opponent, I think we have a fairly strong hand. So I would not fold versus somebody that's playing this aggressive and they're betting as if they had a 10 or a backdoor flush or a backdoor straight versus somebody that's playing tighter. This is probably going to be a fold, but against this opponent, it's definitely a call. So we make the call and let's see what our opponent had. And our opponent had nothing more than a pair of sixes. So they turned their pair of sixes into a bluff on the turn in the river, and we called and we were correct. So in regards to this strategy in general, talking about bluff catching, one of the benefits is when your opponents know that you're capable of calling them down with a medium strength hand, they're going to be less inclined to bluff you in the future on the river because they know that you're capable of calling their bluffs. So that's a benefit of doing this. But on the flip side, we need to understand that even though we know the mathematics are going to dictate that this doesn't have to work that often, this doesn't give you an open license to call every single river bet with any made hand. Against tighter opponents and against opponents that are definitely representing a stronger range where those stronger hands are definitely within their range, we just want to give up and fold our hand. But against aggressive opponents in situations like this, we can look to make those calls. So anyways, that concludes this hand. Let's go ahead and let's take a look at another one. All right, so for the next hand, we're playing zone poker, so I don't have any HUD stats, but let's go ahead and let's get into it. So I have pocket queens, and I open raise in middle position, and I get called by the small blind, and we go to the flop heads up, and it's an ace high flop, so really not that great of a flop for us. Our opponent checks, and with a medium strength hand, I check back this flop, and we go to the turn, and it's not a good turn card either. Now there's two overs. The two overs in the deck are on the board, and our opponent checks again, and we elect to check back the turn as well. And then we go to the river, and the river is a three of clubs, and our opponent fires out a bet on the river, which is around a 2/3 pot size bet. So we're getting 2.67 to 1 pot odds, which we see up here. So for us to be profitable in this call, we need to be right 28% of the time. And in regards to this spot, this is a very odd spot because our opponent could be checking down weak aces. They could have checked a weaker king X hand, but they could also be betting here with, let's say, pocket jacks, pocket tens, 9X hands, a variety of hands that we do beat. So this is going to be a call, but I do expect to lose to some weaker aces and some weaker king X hands a certain percentage of the time. But the great thing about it is that it really doesn't have to work that often. So we make the call, and let's see what our opponent had. And our opponent had king queen. So our opponent elected to check back the king on the turn, and then on the river, bet it for value when the 3 came. So we end up losing this hand, but it's really not that big of a deal because given the pot odds price, we only need to be correct around 28% of the time to be profitable. So anyways, that concludes this hand. Let's go ahead and let's take a look at another one. All right, so let's take a look at one more hand. In this hand, I'm first to act in middle position because we're playing 5-handed, and I open raise with pocket nines. I get a call from cutoff, and everybody else folds, and we go to the flop, and the flop is a jack high. And with a middle strength hand, I elect to check this flop, and our opponent fires out a bet when I check. And taking a look at our opponent, it's only been 11 hands, but our opponent has been extremely aggressive. Our opponent has been playing in a lot of hands. The VPIP and PFR is a 73/55 with a 33% 3-bet so far and a 0% fold versus a flop C-bet. So overall, just looking at that, my overall assumption is that this opponent is fairly aggressive. So when this person bets his flop, I'm really not going to give them that much credit with my pocket nines because They could have a jack, but they could have straight draws, they could have flush draws, they could have smaller pairs. And with a pair of nines, I'm not ready to give up just yet. So I check call and we go to the turn and I check again. The four of clubs is a blank card. It doesn't change anything. None of the draws got there. It really doesn't improve our opponent to a better hand unless they're bluffing with pocket fours and turn that into a set on the turn. But other than that, it really doesn't change anything, and they elect to check back the turn. So when they check back the turn, my assumption is that they bet some sort of a draw or a weaker made hand on the flop to try to get me to fold, or a pure bluff to get me to fold. And when they didn't improve a draw, or when I called, if they had a bluff or a weak hand, they elect to check back the turn. And we go to the river, and the river pairs the board. Now, if I put my opponent on that range and I don't put them on a Jack X hand, betting here doesn't allow me to really get that much value, because I think if I bet this river, they're probably going to fold. So I check and they bet, and my intention is to call because I put them on a missed hand. And so this is an excellent hand to bluff catch in this situation versus an aggressive opponent, where it's hard for my opponent to have a Jack X hand for trip jacks. So I make the call, and let's go ahead and let's see what my opponent had. And my opponent was on a pure bluff. They didn't have anything. They had a 10 high with no showdown value, and so they put out the bluff. And if we take a look at the pot odds we were given, so let's go back to the beginning of the river, and we take a look at the bet sizing is around a 2/3 pot size bet, maybe a little less. And so we're getting 29% pot odds. So for this to be profitable, we only need to win 30% of the time. So that's going to conclude this hand, and it's going to conclude this lecture. If you have any questions, please let me know. If not, thanks for watching, and I'll see you at the next video. Take care.